Oh, there we go. Okay. Well, good afternoon. Welcome to CSIS. My name is Matthew Goodman. I'm a senior advisor for I'm senior advisor for Asian economics here at CSIS, and am delighted to, on behalf of the Asia Foundation and CSIS, to welcome you to this event on women's economic opportunities, lessons from Japan, the Republic of Korea, and the United States. Let me, before I say, first let me welcome our online viewers. We usually have a good, loyal group watching online. Welcome. A couple of administrative things. If you could set your noisemakers on stun. And then also, if we have any kind of security incident, basically follow me. There are emergency exits here, or we can go down the front depending on where the problem is, and assemble across the street in the park. And finally, if anyone needs interpretation, we do have interpretation in all three languages, right? I think, Eliza. And so there should be headsets if you need those. Okay. Well, there are a lot of reasons to believe that women's empowerment is important, but as an economist, I think it's particularly compelling, and particularly when you look at these three countries, or certainly Japan and Korea. Japan and Korea are two of the oldest or fastest, I think in order, they are the oldest and fastest aging economies in the world. They have among the lowest birth rates. I think they compete for the lowest fertility rate in the world at 1.4 roughly, which is way below replacement levels. And they both have growth challenges. Now, when you study macroeconomics, I think on page 1, they talk about GDP and their formulas for how to calculate GDP. Well, one simple way to think about GDP is basically that it is equal to the number of people working times the amount each person can produce. Okay? And so in a country where the number of people is declining and you have a growth challenge, you need to get everybody working and working more productively. And so, to me, it's not just compelling, it's sort of an essential issue for these countries in particular. And I think it is, to me, the kind of basis for this conversation about specific activities that these three countries, all of whom I think recognize that there are challenges in this regard, are doing about it and learning shared experiences. We're delighted to work with the Asia Foundation in hosting this event, which is the capstone to a day of a governmental and civil society trilateral meeting among the three governments that was held at the State Department. So we're delighted to be the sort of capstone here, at least of the serious part of this. I think there may be some more social things that follow. So with that, let me kick this off by having the distinct honor of introducing our keynote speaker, Ambassador Cathy Russell. She is the Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues at the State Department. You have her biographical information. You can see that she's got a distinguished background at the White House, Justice Department, on the Hill. What's not in there is that she literally lives across the street from me. So that's a particular honor for me to have her. So Cathy, please come on up. Thanks.
That's how I get invitations these days. I bug my neighbors. I say, can I come speak, help do something else? Anyway, thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. It's really nice to be here. I'd really like to thank CSIS and the Asia Foundation for hosting us today and for just always doing excellent work in supporting U.S. foreign policy, particularly gender equality. So I'd like to start today, strangely enough, by talking a little bit about golf. I'm sure you've seen that in the upper echelons of business and politics, golf is a way to get things done. And I do not play golf, just to be clear, both here in the United States and in other parts of the world as well. People have actually pointed to golf as an important tool for leaders. You see the president playing golf. He's not the only one. It's a way to get to know people in a low-stress, low-stakes atmosphere. That way, when it's time to make decisions together or grapple with difficult situations, there's an established trust to build on. Gender equality in foreign policy can be a lot like that. It's good for building relationships, it's good for collaboration, but it does something that golf cannot do. It makes the world a better place. There is no doubt that when it comes to gender equality, we need to do more than we're doing now. Around the world, women are vastly underrepresented in politics and the workforce, particularly in leadership positions and other high-paying jobs, and that's something that we talked a lot about today at the trilateral meeting. And it was interesting because all 3 countries and economies had the same challenges. Only 1 in 5 of the world's parliamentarians is a woman, and 1 in every 23 Fortune 500 companies is led by a woman. Meanwhile, women are vastly overrepresented in areas like poverty, illiteracy, and unpaid labor. I've heard people say that poverty has a female face, and that makes sense when you consider that women control just 1/5 of global wealth. I've seen the stories behind these statistics all around the world. I've traveled to more than 40 countries, and in each one, I met with women who've been held back from supporting their families, from pursuing their dreams, from making their own choices. The fact is that no country has achieved full gender equality, and that means that everyone comes from a place where these issues make a difference. The good news is that leaders are beginning to realize that everyone benefits from advancing gender equality. Studies have found that countries with less gender inequality are more secure, peace agreements last longer when women are at the negotiating table. The same is true in economies. A recent McKinsey report showed that if the world closed the gender gap in workforce participation, global GDP would increase by $28 trillion by 2025. I mean, really an extraordinary number. It's about a quarter of the world's current GDP and almost half of the world's current debt. In other words, advancing gender equality is important to peace, to security, and to economic development. It's also important for building relationships. That's what we saw today at the Trilateral Forum on Women's Empowerment between the United States, Japan, and the Republic of Korea. This was the first time we've done this, so our delegations had the chance to make a very little bit of history, but it was still pretty exciting. More importantly, we advanced the trilateral relationship between our countries, and we advanced gender equality. For example, we shared the best practices on how to tackle challenges in our own countries, from encouraging more women to run for office, to changing workplaces so that work for the 21st century really makes sense for families. The forum included elected officials, emerging leaders, and members of the private sector and civil society. I know you'll hear from some of them in a moment, and you'll see what I mean. They really are terrific, and they had so much to contribute to the conversation. But I want to say how important it was that they were part of this forum, because we know that we will not make progress if we try to do this work with governments alone. We just can't do it. As big and powerful as the U.S. government, the Japanese economy, the Korean government, we can't do it by ourselves. As part of the forum, we discussed how to better coordinate our work on global issues, particularly investments each country is making on adolescent girls around the world, which is a big priority for the United States and for others. In the past year and a half, the United States launched its first ever global strategy to empower adolescent girls, as well as a presidential First Lady initiative called Let Girls Learn, which is focused on adolescent girls' education. We're very proud of both our programs and our policies on this issue, and today was an opportunity to share more about our efforts with our colleagues. We discussed how the United States can work with Japan and South Korea to better help girls around the world. No matter what the mechanism, whether it's multilateral fora like the Equal Futures Partnership that President Obama started several years ago and that Korea and Japan just joined, which we're really delighted about, or the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, which is really one of the most vibrant when it comes to women's issues, or future trilateral forums on women's empowerment, it's clear that our countries have important opportunities to work together, and all 3 of us are truly committed to doing that. What's exciting about this work is how quickly it can strengthen the foundation for other joint efforts, because women's issues are truly everyone's issues. For example, a conversation on women's economic empowerment will naturally turn into a conversation on economic development, on supply chains, on trade policy, and that means our collaboration on gender equality can be a bridge to broader cooperation. This is especially important for the United States, Japan, and South Korea because our strategic interests are aligned across the board, from gender equality to economic prosperity to security in the Asia-Pacific region and beyond. Ultimately, we have much to gain by including gender equality in international relations and foreign policy. We can strengthen our partnerships with each other, we can improve and diversify our economies, and we can make the world ultimately a better place. I'd like to end with a quote from a famous American golfer, Arnold Palmer, who died earlier this week. He said that the most rewarding things you can do in life are often the ones that look like they cannot be done. Gender equality sometimes looks like an impossible task, a pursuit without an end. But as we've seen today, we can make progress, and that progress is worth making. Little by little, discussion by discussion, step by step, we can improve the lives of women and girls, men and boys all around the world. And in so doing, we can reach our shared goals of peace, prosperity, and security. So thank you all for your interest in this. I think you're going to love this panel. I'm sorry I can't stay for it. They have me running around like a crazy person today, but I did get to hear everybody earlier. They're really terrific, and I really hope you enjoy it. So thanks so much for having me.
So if I can invite the panel to come on up, and then you'll take over, and I think we're going to remove the
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. It's been a busy month here in Washington, and it's always really exciting to see how much interest there is on such an important topic. First, I'd just really like to thank the CSIS Simon Chair and the State Department's Office of Global Women's Issues for collaborating with us on this event. My name is Eileen Pennington, and I'm the Acting Director of the Women's Empowerment Program at the Asia Foundation. And it's really my distinct pleasure to introduce a terrific panel. I had the opportunity to hear some of their thoughts earlier today, and I know everybody is really going to be fascinated by the personal and professional stories that they have to share with us. So I think Ambassador Russell has really introduced this topic far more eloquently than I have, so I'm going to jump in. We're going to have a brief moderated conversation, and then we're going to open up for questions so that we have an opportunity for you all to be able to ask your questions as well. So very briefly, I just want to introduce our group, and you have the bios with you so you can look more deeply at their backgrounds. But we have on the end Ms. Jie Son. She is now a professor at Ewha Women's University, and she's also a senior communications strategist at the World Bank, and formerly the president of the Korea International Broadcasting Foundation. So we'll be hearing some of her experiences as first female CEO of a leading broadcaster in Korea. Next we have Mr. Dan Henkel. He's the president of the GAP Foundation and the senior vice president for global sustainability for GAP Incorporated. And he was formerly the senior vice president for human resources. And GAP's been a real leader on gender equality issues, so I think we'll really learn a lot from him today. And finally, we have Ms. Emi Kiyota. She's an environmental gerontologist and an organizational cultural change specialist. And she's also the founder of an NGO called Ibasho, which works to integrate older persons and their views and experiences into their communities. So without any further ado, we're going to start by talking just a bit about each of your experiences and shedding some light onto how you've personally been affected by efforts to advance women's economic empowerment and gender equality in the workplace. So maybe I could start with Jie and ask you, we just were talking about the fact that you were the first female CEO of a major broadcasting company, and I'd really be interested in hearing, when you think about the road that you traveled to become this first female CEO that was really groundbreaking, and you became a role model for so many young women, I'm sure. What were some of the milestones that were important to you in reaching that position? Or perhaps you could share some of the obstacles that you had to overcome, and what that's taught you about efforts to advance women economically.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here. It's such a pleasure. I've had an interesting conversation all day and just an ending of a very interesting day. I don't play golf either, so no golf anecdotes from me. But I'm a journalist by trade, so I started in 1985. I'm dating myself. 85 as pretty much one of the very first female journalists in Korea that covered an area that was not women, that was not culture or women, for a small magazine called Business Korea. And just to say how weird it was at that time, every time I would call any company and say, this is Son Ji-ae, asking for an interview from Business Korea, immediately the first answer would be, what, Mrs. Korea? Would be the first answer, question. But it's always been, from my perspective, at an age where I started in Korea, you were always the first female doing anything. If you're covering business, that was the first female. If you were covering business and you went out on a reception for a major bank, you were the only female there that wasn't serving. So you sort of get used to the fact that you are either become the focus of a lot of things. And I think that sort of propels you to try to do better, to try to really to excel at what you do, because you know that so many others could follow if you do well, and you could shut a lot of doors if you don't. So I think that got me into a lot of places. Being the first woman to cover business was great, but also I think being able to work for CNN for 15 years was also sort of set the standard. A lot of women looked at me and covering CNN and thought, wow, if she can do it, I can do it, type of thing. So that sort of led me to a lot of minds. I don't. There's too many of them to cite in a short time, but I think that's sort of a background of where I come from.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Dan, I wonder if I could ask you've spent a lot of your professional career at The Gap, and The Gap has been such a leader in promoting gender equality in the workplace. And we often, when we think about advancing women economically, we think about the effect that it has on women, but you worked for a company that really put that at the center of its business model for a long time, and I wonder if you could share for us, how did that shape your career and your thinking?
Sure. So I'd like to start with the first company that I started with was a high-tech company in Silicon Valley. I think at the time it was probably 90% male. And so when I started at Gap 5 years later, my first experience was I was part of a group project and went into the room, and there were 12 people on the project, and there were 11 women and me. And so it was a completely different experience. And so Gap is 74% female. And one of the things that we've been working on very hard is just making sure that women are represented in every level of leadership, and that's through our store management all the way to senior leadership. So 4 of our 5 businesses are run by women today. And one of the things that we say, and I believe, is that what's good for women is good for business, and what's good for women is good for the community, and the last thing is what's good for women is good for all of us. And I think a lot of our focus on women, and if you think about if you have a workforce of 74% women, it makes sense that you would focus on women. But a lot of the things that we've done to address initially some concerns that women in our company had end up being good things for every single person that works for the company. I'll give you just an example. We implemented a program called a results-only work environment, which is really trying to focus on getting your job done versus focus on FaceTime in the office and so on and so forth. So basically the premise is you can work anywhere you want, anytime you want, and you can kind of manage your job around your life. And so what happened is, so we sort of said that this will help us because we were having a situation where we were losing a lot of employees when they'd go out on maternity leave and then they wouldn't return. And we were saying, what could we do to actually make this a little bit easier? What we found was implementing that program, a lot of our employees, our male employees, were saying, hey, that works for me too. I actually have my kid's soccer game and I need to drop off my son at school or whatever the case may be. We all have lives and we all have things that that are competing with each other. And so what I've seen is as we've focused on some of these initiatives, when you really deploy them, you have the entire workforce basically saying, this works for us, and this makes sense for business. And the last thing I'll say is that I just feel a real values connection with the company, and I think this focus on equality is something that I deeply feel, and it's absolutely the driving reason that's kept me at the company for 24 years.
Wow, that's great. Emmy, you're also working on an equality issue, and I think we all really connect with that idea of having your values resonate with the place where you work. I wonder, you've done a lot of very interesting things, but I'm particularly fascinated as somebody who comes from civil society and works for an NGO, in the fact that you founded your own NGO, Ibasho, and would love to hear more from you about what it was like to get into a sector that's relatively underserved and what kinds of opportunities and challenges you faced and what that taught you about empowering women, especially since that's part of your big mandate.
Yeah. I would like to share one comment that my friend told me when I was giving a presentation. She said, wow, you're a Japanese woman standing in front of all these people in the United States. And you just created not-for-profit organization and you're doing a fundraising. And I actually shocked me. I was really shocked because I just didn't think about it. You know, a lot of time people ask me, like, you're a Japanese woman, probably you had a more difficult time than other women in the States. Maybe, but I don't know. I just didn't think about it. But at the same time, as a woman, I do appreciate the fact that I'm in the environment where I could start not-for-profit organization without much struggle, because I had a mentor and I had a supporter, and half a man, half a women. They just supported me to start a not-for-profit organization because they believed in what I tried to do. So that part of it, I really do appreciate it. I'm not quite sure if I could do the same in Japan, because I don't know how other people might have perceived, and I might be a little more worried about how social norm would, sort of give me a pressure on being a woman. So this not-for-profit organization, I started because of the necessity more than I was curious. A lot of time people said, oh, you're doing a great job. But I really have to say these aging issues, especially women and aging, it is big issues. We're just not talking about it, but we cannot ignore it. And I think that we don't respect elders the way we should, and we have to all concern because we are going to get old. It's going to be us.
It's happening.
Yes. So, I was living in a nursing home, and I saw these older people. Maybe you think that older people are like frail and just weak. But it's really wrong, actually. When you talk to them, they have a spirit in their eyes. They just don't have opportunity to help others. And I really wanted to give them opportunity to contribute back to our society. And that's very simple, but I just really wanted to try it because nobody was really trusting what older people could do. And I think it's sort of correlates to the women's issues. A lot of people think that it cannot be done. Older people has to be looked after. We'll decide what's good for you. But older people don't want that, and we don't have enough financial strength to be able to continue what we do. So I just really wanted to use that opportunity to start not-for-profit so that we can give older people a voice and ask them to do what they want to do, basically.
That's really inspiring. I wonder if I could follow up on that, because you just mentioned some of the challenges that older people in general face, like financial stability and having a limited opportunity to have voice. Do you notice any gender dynamics in particular? I know that you're working in a number of different countries, including a project in Japan. Maybe you can share some insights that you found about older women and the particular challenges that they face.
I think that in the developed part of the world that has pension system, I think women, some countries, they don't have access to pensions. That is a big problem. And a lot of times they never worked, and if they're not entitled to access to their husband's pension, that's another problem, because normally women live longer than men.
Right.
So you were talking about poverty issues. And I work in the developing part of the world. Like in Nepal, we just try to do a workshop about the place to create a virtual project. We could not have women and older men in the same room because they're not supposed to be in the same room, and it's still the problem. So now we are just trying to connect them. And when you ask them questions why they can't be in the same room, it's no legal limitations. They just, that's the social norm. So, you know, just, but I think economical impact in the developing part of the world, especially for the women, are not very quite well researched yet. But I think, like in Nepal's case, a lot of men goes out to work in the Middle East, and women are the ones who are left in the village. And a lot of time they do suffer from the financial and also just the general help they need in the daily life.
So I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of really thinking about economic empowerment and how to meet women where they are and offer them different kinds of opportunities that fit their circumstances. Maybe we could shift the conversation as we've started talking more about gender constraints and the particular issues that women face when they're trying to get more involved either in the formal labor force or starting their own businesses. One issue that we talk a lot about is equal pay, and of course the Gap has really been a leader on this issue in particular. Recently took the equal pay pledge that the White House encouraged many corporations to take. I wonder if you could share with us a little bit of the Gap's thinking. Of course, you'd also undertaken some analysis to understand where you were. So you could share some of what you learned and why the issue of equal pay is so important when we think about gender equality and advancing women's economic opportunities.
Sure. So I'll start with the backstory on how we came to do this analysis. So our company was founded by Don and Doris Fisher, and it's a nice story because it was a 50% investment. They both put in, believe it or not, they both put in $21,000 to start Gap back in 1969. So equal investment, and I really feel like they kind of instilled this culture of equality. So we were coming up on our 45th anniversary as a company, and we were thinking about ways to honor Doris Fisher. Don Fisher has passed away, and we were saying, you know, she instilled this culture of equality. Let's take a look at how we're paying women and men. We thought it was actually going to be a pretty good result, but we hadn't done the actual analysis. So we undertook the analysis, and I still remember the day because we got the results, and we actually got an exact 100.0% result. So there was actually no difference, so we could say we were paying equally for equal work. So we thought we must have done something wrong. We couldn't get 100.0%. So we actually had the data validated externally, and by a firm that actually was much more expert than we were. Did we do the analysis correctly? Are we looking at this the right way? And they said that yes, we had done the analysis appropriately, and we weren't overstating a claim. The other thing I'll say is that we did this first in the US, but then we took the study globally, and we got the same result. So that was actually a really nice thing too, to as we sort of exported our culture, we feel like there were things that we exported that actually helped us get to that result in other places as well. But we see this as one of the pillars, if we look at why we've been successful in moving some of our work forward. We look at career development, we look at pay and pay equality, and then we look at this issue of flexibility. And those are sort of the three pillars that have really driven our women's empowerment work.
Wonderful. So career development is another area where the Gap has some very impressive results, and you've managed to achieve parity at management levels and leadership levels between men and women. How did the Gap manage that? What were some of the keys to being able to get women up to a high level of leadership and management within the company?
Yeah, and what I'd start by saying is that it certainly was not always the case. And so I think one of the advantages when you're with a company for 24 years, you actually have enough time to actually look at progress over time. And so one of the things we did, and I'm sure this is true in every company, but we would see that there might be a situation like, let's say our assistant managers were in actually a pretty good equality state, but we were having problems at the store manager level. And so what we ended up doing is we have development opportunities really at each stage of your career. And I call it connecting the pipes, basically. So just saying, like, if you come in as a store associate and you want to get to the first level of leadership or management, here are some things you can do, and then so on and so forth. And I would say at each place we would hit a ceiling actually, and say, we're good till here, but then we're not so good here. And so it was just this intentional sort of like, okay, so what are we doing there? And then what are we doing there? And I think what drives all this at the end of the day is what I just untapped potential. The fact that we had all of this potential sitting in the organization, and how do we unleash that potential and give people the opportunities and assignments and development opportunities to actually get to reach their full potential. And so I think we feel like for the first time we're in a position now where we're really tapping into the full talent pool that we have.
Which must make a big difference also in your bottom line.
Yeah, I think it's and one of the things that I really do believe, I think if you're focused on performance, and if that's truly what your measure is, then you're going to get to an equal result as it relates to women in leadership, but also pay equality. It's when you focus on things that shouldn't matter about how you evaluate talent that you're not going to get to an equal result. Yeah.
Thank you. And Gia, you mentioned this phenomenon of being the only woman in the room, and then you became the head of a broadcasting company. Was the pipeline strategy that Dan has just described also a strategy that you found to be helpful in trying to get more women to move up the chain of leadership and management, or what kind of strategies did you use to encourage more gender equitable workplace norms?
Well, when I joined Arirang TV, I joined as a CEO. So it was so I did not go up the ladder in Arirang TV. I think what helped me is, especially in a country like Korea, is that I was able to grow in an environment, in a CNN environment, which actually was relatively gender neutral, and so reporting was all that mattered. It wasn't whether you were a female or a male, and so you were able to improve your skills and get your worth up in an environment with a very global type of situation. It happens a lot in Korea. Korean women who have entered a very Korean society find it very hard to move up the ladder. But women who have entered a more multinational environment find that their strengths are nurtured, developed, and they move up the ladder. And then later on, after they've built up their skills, then they actually are then moved over to a Korean company as one of the more executive levels. So you find a lot of Korean women on an executive level who've had past experiences in international companies, P&G, I don't know if Gap's one of them, but a lot of the international companies, Kellogg's is known for nurturing a lot of Korean women, and that's what happened to me. So once I got to Arirang TV, looking at the workforce in Arirang TV, there weren't a lot of female executives of a level where I could nurture them. So then you're sort of left with women, just to encourage the whole environment of more of a gender neutral kind of environment. So it's trying to make sure that gender wasn't an issue when promotions came up or hiring was done. So you had to fight against a lot of these things. Some fights I won, some fights I lost, but I think the actual fighting was the important asset of while I was what I did at Arirang TV when I was there.
Do you feel that you were able to influence the culture in some way?
Well,
sometimes a good fight is important.
Yeah, I think the very fact that I was there did have an impact. One of the things, I was there for about 3 years. One of the things was that while I was there, people said, do you know you have a nickname? And I said, what is it? It's like midwife. Midwife. And I said, why? And he says, a lot of women have gotten pregnant while you were CEO. And I said, that's strange. I'm thinking, why is that? I haven't done a study, so I haven't interviewed all of them. I've signed a lot of maternity leaves while I was there. But it almost feels like while I was there at CEO, a lot of the female employees felt more comfortable making that decision to become a mother while working, or working mother decision. So I sort of feel that maybe that kind of environmental shift I created. I'm not sure if it continued, but at least they had their children, so I think I did a little bit of good.
That's fantastic. My father-in-law was a lawyer and a partner in a firm here in Washington, and in the 60s, when he had 4 small children, his firm decided to start a leave policy. You could take some time off and really invest in yourself and come back refreshed. So he thought, okay, I'll be the role model, and he took the whole family off to Italy, and he was the only one who ever did it. And that was one of the real sadnesses for him as a feminist and somebody who really wanted to see workplace culture be more open and inclusive, that didn't work. So congratulations.
Thank you.
That's really exciting. Amy, we've talked about some of the barriers for women, and one thing we haven't talked about yet is caregiving, and you touched on that a bit. Disproportionately in almost every country in the world, women bear more of the burden for caregiving, whether it's taking care of their children or taking care of their families or taking care of elders. What effect do you think that has on women and their aspirations to be economically empowered and involved, and really to be able to seek paid work? Because of course what we're talking about is real work. It's a lot of work, but it's not paid.
Yeah.
And what are some of the strategies that we could think about that would make it easier for women to balance those different responsibilities, including getting other people to be involved in doing some of that work?
That's a very hard question to answer, of course. But I think a few things I would like to suggest is much more philosophical level to begin with. We sort of think about work in a certain way, and we think it's office work, or maybe just take maternity leave from full-time job. But I think because of the technology advancement and societal change, I think we should all start to think about reconceptualizing what work means for women, and I think that is going to change. So I think that is going to hopefully change the way we care for children the older adults. We just was having a discussion this afternoon among a few Japanese friends of mine, that I think we shouldn't really label caregiving as a burden. I think that's something that we should stop doing it, and we should actually start to think about caregiving as a care. It is something everybody has to do. When you have kids, you care about the children. When you have parents who die, who needs a care, you provide the care. It's I think the current dialogue that I'm very concerned about is that if you look after someone because they need assistance, we treat them as a burden. They're actually an asset of the community, asset of our society, both children and older people. But at the same time, as a working woman in our society, in the current situation, to look after children that takes a few years off, maybe just maternity leave and just provide care, intensive care. But I think elder caregiving, like your parents' caregiving, is a little bit more complex because you don't know how long that is going to be. So you cannot really ask company to say, I am going to be providing care for my parents for 5 months. You never know, it could be 10 years. So it's really a tough judgment to make. But I think we should at least start making that available for people to take a leave for looking after their parents, and it should be considered to be a work. I think that's why I hope public sector is come in and just try to subsidize the care, because you're not using professional care and the family members looking after your parents. You're also you're providing the same care. You're just not paid. But I think again, if we were to be able to start to think about that as a part of it, could be like care, like a paid job, like Germany is doing at this moment, that would be something to think about it. And one more point is that we don't have a traditional family household anymore, but policies based on the traditional family. I personally don't have children. A lot of people have untraditional marriage, or many people don't have like kids, or like women live longer, so you cannot really rely on to the family caregiving. That's part of what we try to do through the NGO, but I think we should really just provide more resources to build environment and the community social asset to be able to support individual, to be connected directly to community if you don't have a family system. That's another things that we should think about as a part of caregiving.
There's been a movement underway to try to understand better what that unpaid work would cost and what it would add to GDP if we did monetize it. Does that make a difference in making it a more valued area of work and commitment, do you think?
I actually think that's the kind of study is really helpful, because there are a lot of, the government is paying for, like, for example, in Japan, 90% of care is paid by government. So if you are to use professional caregivers, then you just pay 10% of what you need. But if you like to look after your parents because you love them, then all of a sudden you don't get anything. And I don't think that's the way that society has to work. But I think starting up with like how much values that we actually, those informal caregivers are actually making, to be able to identify it first is a very important task to start.
And then take pride from it.
Yeah.
We've talked a little bit about older generations, and I'm also very interested in hearing about the newest generations, the young, and what you're seeing, GA, at Iowa University, Women's University, where, of course, right now you're a visiting professor. What are you seeing in terms of this young generation of young women in Korea, and what they're telling you about their career aspirations and what they see in terms of opportunity or some of the barriers or obstacles that they fear they'll encounter?
Well, the young women who are going off into the world, number one, in Korea, the percentage of women who are going into higher education have now outpaced men for quite some time. So a lot more women are going into higher education, and it's partly due to institutions like mine where it's all female education, and we're 130 years old. So it came from a time when it was not proper for men and women to be educated together. So it allowed this place, a venue for women to be continuously educated. So in educational levels, if anything, women are ahead of the game. But once they start to try to enter the workforce, then it's a different game altogether. And especially, in a situation like today in Korea, where youth unemployment is quite high, we're past 9%. This is double the average unemployment rate. And so, youth unemployment is a major problem in Korea. So everyone's focused on youth unemployment, and within that umbrella, trying to get a job as a young female is even tougher. I mean, you have to use every trick in the book. You have to have everything perfectly set, and still, the odds of getting the job that you want are pretty low. And my worry a little bit is that when hard times fall, it's many times that women get get hurt the most. And I'm trying to figure out why that is. And one of the aspects, when I was CEO at Arirang TV, we would interview young prospects and young women. And especially women who are in their late 20s, early 30s. And we would get an interview, and we would have an HR director sitting next to me, and we would talk, and the head of the department who wants to get a new employee, and we would do the interview, and there'd be a young woman coming in, perfect qualifications, actually better qualifications than any male, perfect interview, really motivated. And then she walks out, and the HR and director and the guy says, "No, we want to hire the man." I said, "But why? The woman is much more qualified." And he said, "Well, she's just become 30. She's just gotten married. She's going to probably have children. She's going to want maternity leave and then childcare leave, and she's going to be, absent for at least a year." So the department head wants someone who he can work with now. He needs somebody now. And he says, "Well, I would prefer the man." That's one battle I did win. I said, "Don't do that to me." So we hired the female.
Great.
She did leave after a short while, not for maternity, but for a better job. But the thinking that women take their jobs and their careers less seriously than a man is still very prevalent. And in that situation, when hard times fall and you think, we can only have one breadwinner per family, as what happened during the Asian financial crisis, then it falls upon the female to step back and take the sacrifice. So I think it's really tough for young women, and our students, and female students all around Korea find it really hard to get their foot in the door.
Having seen the underbelly of hiring practices, you have a lot of insights into strategies that young women might be able to use to counteract what's going on behind those closed doors. Do you coach them or mentor them, or is there anything that the university is doing to try to help them counter some of those biases?
My university, because of the situation, my university goes full force.
Great.
When any job opportunity arises, they will take. It's like I actually seen some of them in action, and it's headhunter, multiplied by 5. They will say, well, we have a whole university. We have 15,000 students, graduates. There must be one of these that meets your qualifications. So, they really try very hard to get employees, and it's not just the students. Increasingly, university professors, the judgment of how well they're doing is how many university students they can get employed. So
there's an underlying profit
there's a
motive.
lot of incentive to do that, besides the fact that you're doing it for the good of the entire country, is what I think.
Well, I want to make sure we leave some time for questions, so maybe I'll just ask one question for all of you. You were participating with the State Department earlier today in an exchange talking about women's economic advancement and gender equality writ large. When you think about your own experiences and some of the topics that we've talked about today, I think Ambassador Russell said very eloquently how important it is for us to be able to work together, government working with the private sector, working with civil society on some of these key issues that will really make a difference in getting more women into the workforce, making sure that they have more opportunities to be leaders and managers, and then for both men and women to be able to benefit from a more gender equitable workplace. What would you say would be some of the real priorities for cooperation across those three sectors? And Dan, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've learned along the way is we get much better answers when we actually have the right partners around the table. And so today was amazing because we could hear diverse experiences across sectors and across countries. And then in any one of those sessions, you're picking up amazing new ideas around things that could potentially work in your workplace. So, I mean, I think one of the things that we've tried to do as we embark on any new challenge is get the right people around the table. Within the company, but also external experts as well. I mentioned with the pay equality, we really did lean on external experts to make sure that we were doing the analysis and we're thinking about it in the right way. And I think likewise, just leveraging all of the expertise that exists in the world today, it's pretty amazing. And I think we'll come to better answers if we're actually working in collaboration.
Thank you. I mean, how about you? What would you say are some of the priority areas where we could work together and really advance?
I think that I think just collaboration between government and civil society. Like, if I could just speak from what I do, I've realized if, for example, like an aging field, the government will say, yes, we have to utilize elders' wisdom and experience. So we're gonna do that. And just community group will be like what to do. Just have no idea because there's a huge gap between what government makes statements to what local people can actually do or local government can actually do. So I think that to fill those gaps, I think we should be able to work together because how we behave is heavily influenced by social norm and the networks that we have. So that if we don't change people's mindset, they cannot change their behaviors. So I think that's the piece of like a big gap to shift mindset change by the practice and the sort of project base so that people can see it to believe and just try to change it. I've never done women's project, but I have a feeling that it's trying to change women's equality and that I have a feeling that the government and the civil society can work in that way to reach out.
I agree. Changing mindsets is really that's the key to changing almost everything that separates us from achieving gender equality. Is just being more open to solutions and understanding the other people's experiences and how they can contribute. So, Gia, maybe I'll just ask you to share what you see as some of your priorities.
Well, I don't know about priorities, but today, it started conversations very important conversations. And I thought that was very important amongst ourselves, of course with other countries as well. But amongst even the Korean delegation, we started asking ourselves, why don't we have Emily's List in Korea? We didn't even know that there was a possibility. Well, I'm sure people knew. I didn't know, but so I started asking, why don't we have an Emily's List in Korea? Why can't we start an organization that elects or helps funds other females just because they're good female politicians? And so this kind of conversation starting, because I think mindsets are really difficult to change, but it's a little easier when you have examples of others that actually benefited from this, or the knowledge provides the right kind of environment in which your imagination and your creativity can foster. And I think that was what I thought was really fascinating in such a relatively small and very select environment. You get people really concentrating on focusing on issues, and then these kind of examples are exchanged, and you hear about Gap, and you hear about Deloitte, you hear about Japan and what Japan's going through, and so you get these kind of ideas flowing in, and so as well as flowing out, and I think that's going to be a very important aspect of how we start changing people's minds.
It really is quite striking how all three governments have really put gender equality and trying to advance some of those efforts right in the center of policy making. It's a big shift from what we've seen over the last 20 years, and data's played a big part in that. But I think you're absolutely right, just the opportunity to be able to share information on what works. We've all tried things that just haven't worked, so also sharing what is not working is really powerful. So with that, I'd like to just thank our panelists for the first part of our conversation. Thank you very much for your frank thoughts. And now I'll open it up to the floor for questions. If you could please share your name and affiliation, and please try to keep your questions focused on women's economic empowerment and gender equality. Yes, sir. We have roving mics that will come to you.
Yes, Dave Fitzgerald, retired State Department. I lived in both Japan and Korea back in the 70s and 80s. And I was just, would be interested in the panel's comments on two sort of issues of employment in Japan and South Korea that are somewhat different than the mindset in America, and that is an emphasis on seniority and lifetime employment. I've seen some recent reporting from both South Korea and Japan about the mindset amongst younger people in both countries there that they would still favor lifetime employment rather than what I guess we celebrate in this country in recent decades about the glories of being your own, running your own business or being in your self-employed or whatever. That's a mindset, and I don't see that there hasn't been that much of a change in either Japan or Korean industrial organizations, company organizations, that either tries to break down the system of seniority, promote from people above their seniors, in the kind of way which would enhance the performance that Mr. I forget your last name, but Dan talked about, talking about performance rather than seniority. And in both Japan and Korean society, traditionally, it's all been about seniority. And performance doesn't really mean anything except good behavior.
Thank you.
Comment on that.
That's great. I'll take another question. I'll take a few questions and then we'll respond. So up here in the second row.
Good afternoon. My name is Fariba Parsa. I am founder and director for an upcoming nonprofit organization called Women's E-Learning Leadership. Well, I'm originally from Iran, and I can hear many similarities what you describe in Japan and Korea with Iran. and also women in Middle East and other places. I would like your comments for creating a global collaboration. It is instead of divided in regions, working together. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll have one more question over on the far side. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Wen Zhonghong coming from Taiwan. And I have one interesting question. Is it a good idea to design a law to require certain proportion of director on board should be female, that like North European countries they did? It's a good idea because more female leaders may promote more female managers and hire more female workers. That's my question.
Thank you. So we've got a couple of interesting questions here around the issue of merit. What does it mean to promote people on the basis of merit? What does it mean to be setting targets so that you have gender equitable management and leadership, but still have good performers in those positions? And then a great question about global cooperation and what can we be doing more to share our good practices? Who would like to jump in first?
Well, since the first question touched upon Korea, I'll just maybe start with that. The seniority has, as you've rightly pointed out, been a major factor in a lot of Korean corporations, which are big and family-owned. Recently, though, Korean companies have understood that this can be an impediment towards globalizing and getting ready for a future generation. So they've tried to get rid of seniority as being the restrictive system that it has. So they've tried things like Samsung has actually tried getting rid of titles. Managers was always, in Korea it's not Mr. Kim or it's not TJ. It would be Kim Chief Bureau, a chief of, I think it probably the same in Japan, Kim Manager. There will always be a title after the name. That would be the name. So they try to get rid of all the titles, and so that it creates a more flexible atmosphere where the title is not entitles you to certain privileges, but actually the creative atmosphere does. That it hasn't taken root yet. You still, all, as in Korea, the desks are arranged in a certain order, seniority, everyone from, if you walk into an office, people at the front are normally the lowest, and then the people in the back are the seniors, and all of that. It hasn't changed that much, but they're trying. I mean, Korea's, in terms of trying to adapt to the changing global environment, are trying, and that has helped females, become a little bit less restricted. But I'm using things like tried and less because we're not there yet. The effort is being made, but we're not there yet. And this is why one of the reasons that women choose to enter into professions that don't have these kind of corporate structures. So the ones that you take tests and exams for, being lawyers, being accountants, being teachers, some things that you don't have to work up a ladder for. And so in those kind of professions, women take a huge proportion. These days, women enter and take government tests, become public servants. So that, in a way, shows that it hasn't fully been unstructured. Hopefully, it will get there, but we have a little ways to go. That's what I feel.
I'll take a crack at the idea of a law about for a certain percentage of women, and we are participating with the Women's Leadership Institute at Stanford. It's called the Clayman Institute. And they have a goal that they call 30 and 30, which is that by 2030, they'd like to see 30% of CEOs for Fortune 500s be female. And I was in the audience and I said, that's not ambitious enough. I said it should be 50%, 50 and 30. They said, listen, we are at 4% today. So 4% of Fortune 500 companies have female CEOs. So you think about the makeup of a lot of boards ends up being drawn from the CEO talent pool, right? So it's not mysterious why boards tend to be more male. But I actually think there's something about goal setting and getting, you can get everyone involved in sort of saying what is possible. I think that it's exciting, things like the Sustainable Development Goals, setting really, really ambitious long-term objectives and getting as many people as you can and organizations behind it, and then going for it and trying to figure out, like, it may not seem possible, but what if we could eliminate poverty by 2030? I mean, those are just huge, huge, huge objectives, right? So why wouldn't we do the same thing here and say on representation of women on boards, CEOs, so on and so forth? I think that there could be real traction, and you get companies. I actually think President Obama and the White House have done a nice job of, on certain initiatives, getting companies to sign on to this pledge, the Equal Pay Pledge, sign on to this pledge. It just gets companies and others more committed to moving things forward.
I completely agree. I think setting that culture of expectation, if you're going to have a hiring committee, at a minimum you're looking at both male and female resumes and you're really interviewing people, setting those targets and goals and having senior levels, if it's an organization or if it's the White House or the government, saying, look, this is really where we need to go. You tell us how we get here. But it's not acceptable for us to stay at 4%.
Right.
So you have to, I agree, you have to have those targets. Yes, more questions.
Thank you so very much. This was a fantastic panel. This was a fantastic panel. My name is Carmen Niethammer. I'm with the International Finance Corporation at the World Bank Group. And I think you very nicely placed or posed to us this afternoon both the business case and the development case. And I thank you for having tackled it so very nicely. The work that I do with the International Finance Corporation is to actually look at the business case for women's employment opportunities. We just completed the She Works report with GAP, and thank you very much for all of your participation in making that possible. One of the new projects that we also just launched last week is on tackling childcare, tackling employer-supported childcare, and we're actually doing that work with the support of the Japanese government financially, so very, very grateful for being able to do that. And what we're doing is we're looking at different childcare models that employers have put in place in order to help both their female and male employees in meeting childcare challenges, but also then being able to have better bottom line benefits for their companies, so being able to attract and retain both female and male workers in their companies. And we're doing case studies around the world. So my question for the panel is, are there any fantastic companies that you know of where that has been working really well and that are known in your countries for doing this employer-supported childcare support that we could include in our global work? And then secondly, specifically to you, Ms. Kiyota, you mentioned how difficult it is to do elderly childcare, and I think in the future we will be facing the employer-supported elderly childcare situation. Have you ever seen any company do that from a business case perspective, specifically in Japan? Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. I'll take one or two more questions. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jordan Arnswald, and I work for the U.S. Department of Energy. The question I have is, with South Korea and Japan set to host both of the next upcoming Olympics in 2018 and 2020, do you see that hosting an event on such an international scale and being on the international stage will provide an opportunity for increased women's empowerment, or do you not see that as something that's going to happen?
Thank you. And one more question in the front. in the front on the far side. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. My name is Lauren Zellick, and I spent 8 years growing up in Japan before university back in the US. And through all my journeys, ever since I was a little girl living in Japan, I had so many ideas, and now I'm finally putting them into action, diving into the social entrepreneurship space, building a travel startup. And I actually just got back from the Olympics and learned a lot, and so I'm looking forward to 2020 in a few years and being a part of that. But I just wanted, in the US, we see women really starting to get into the entrepreneurship field, building their own companies, scaling them. And so my question is maybe for Emmy and Jia. Could you shed some light on, the growth of women as social entrepreneurs in your respective countries, Japan and Korea? And obviously, Dan, I'd love to hear your insight on that.
Great, thank you. So some really interesting questions related to elder care and to child care and how employers can directly support those kinds of offerings, and then opportunities in terms of more international engagement through the Olympics and women entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs in particular.
I can start with the care for older people. I have never seen one. That company will provide care for older people. I think there is a quite important reason behind it, actually, because older people normally like to be in the familiar environment, especially when they have dementia. So just bringing them to outside of their familiar community to their daughter or son's work environment can be a little traumatic. So it might not be good for the elders themselves, but I still think that if the employers can actually provide child care for the caregivers, that's very, very helpful, because we are talking about growing number of older people, at the same time serious shortage of caregivers. So we don't want to lose any of the caregivers at the nursing homes or any elder care setting at this moment. But a lot of people, especially the caregivers, are relatively lower income women. So, if they can bring their own little children, and they don't have to just go around and pick up one kid and this daycare to bring them to another daycare because they cannot make their ends meet within one job. But if you can just have a daycare for the children, it's good for them, and also that is going to reduce their traveling, and you can retain the caregivers themselves.
Sure. One of the things that's been interesting for me is just to see a source of innovation for us is we have a global supply chain, and we're working with suppliers and garment factories throughout the world, and they are becoming increasingly sophisticated. And one of the things that is true in the garment sector is that the turnover rate year over year is actually very high. And that actually is a real problem, not just because they have to continuously re-recruit and develop, but it's a productivity drain as well. So retaining a workforce actually matters significantly, especially when it's a workforce that's 80% female. So I think sometimes constraint actually drives innovation. So I'm seeing some of the most innovative solutions in some of these really progressive suppliers that are basically, it is on-site childcare, it is close access to schools, it is on-site health care, it is on-site, we have some suppliers that have on-site social workers that are actually coming in and helping women with all of the other things that are going on in their lives, including actually elder care. And so sort of a wraparound of services that basically says, we're going to help, we're going to meet you where you are. And as a result, and we have some suppliers that have just almost no turnover because people appreciate so much what they're getting. And so I think that for us, it's just like being open to innovation wherever it might be, whether that's within the US from another big multinational company or from one of our suppliers. Good ideas are everywhere.
let me tackle two questions very shortly. I'll try to make it very short. Korea's labor, women, female, there's the infamous M curve, where in their 20s, female enter the workforce at a very high level. 60-some% of women enter the workforce, and then it dips as they go into 30s and the childbearing area, and then in their 40s and 50s, it steps up a little bit, and then it ebbs out. So we have the infamous sort of leaning M curve. So the emphasis on the Korean government is to how to make this dip less, so that women do not have to leave the workforce as they get married and as they have kids. A friend of an acquaintance of mine works at a bank, SE. It's a combination of a Korean and Western bank, whose name escapes me right now, but I have to PR it. But anyway, so what they do is, you know how it's like take your daughter to work day kind of thing? What they do is not only the daughter, but take your family to work day type of. So what they do is they invite so what happens with a lot of Korean women is that they rely on their parents, mothers, or their mothers-in-law for childcare. And so they invited the mothers and the mothers-in-law to work. And so they came to work and so looked around, and so she says the amazing result, the outcome was that these elderly women came to work and saw their daughters or daughters-in-law working, and when they were interviewed later on, says, I never thought of my daughter, and because it's a new concept, you know, of a daughter or daughter-in-law really working at an important position. I don't know what they thought. They was like, you know, cleaning or something. Not that cleaning is a bad thing, but you know, they had a misconception of what kind of work their daughter or daughter-in-law was doing. And so when they returned, they said, well, I'm going to keep her at work. I'm going to take care of the child. I'm going to support her all throughout. So there was that kind of reaction about, you know, and the women really got a lot of courage to continue to work, even though through the tough times. So that kind of effort seems to be having a more creative aspect of trying to study what the situation is and then deal with it in that way. The other aspect is the entrepreneurship in terms of, because, you know, the dip, when they come back, it's difficult to come back to your old job. And so when you come back to a job that's a much lower level. So what happens for what Korean government is at times trying to encourage is for them to be entrepreneurs, to use the knowledge and the experience they had when they were younger to start their own companies. So it's one of the outlets of getting women back in the workforce. So it actually has had results, and it's and so the women's entrepreneurship is growing. The drawback is that it's not in the more creative industries, but more in the service industries. You know, running a cafe or running a restaurant, which tends to be a little bit more vulnerable to economic downturns. So there's that, but at least that's one area in which I think women's entrepreneurship is gaining ground.
Well, I think we've almost run out of time, so this has been a really fascinating discussion, and I think one thing that's so invigorating is how common some of the solutions to these problems can be, that we're all grappling with similar challenges with differences, and when we work together and talk about what's working and not working, we can really come to some more effective solutions. And also, frankly, just that we're talking about it. It's very exciting. So I really want to thank you all for taking the time to be with us today, and for you as well. So thank you very much.